Solving equations. Today you're going to review how to solve equations with Ms.Y Cavazos. So, before we start, I want to review a few things. Some of those few things are inverse operations. So, inverse operations, you might have heard opposite operations, but the proper way of saying is inverse. So addition we know is plus, we add. The inverse, the opposite, is subtraction. You subtract. Okay, so division, we know we are going to include division in solving. So the inverse of division, the opposite of division, is going to be multiplication. Times. So either the x, which we're trying to avoid, so instead it's the dot, or we use parentheses. Okay, so with that being said, inverse operations, we're going to review some vocabulary words that will be very important for this video, for this lesson. So we need to know that blank operations are mathematical operations that undo each other. That's your key word, undo. So we're talking about inverse. Inverse operations undo each other. To solve an equation, you need to isolate the variable. We need to get that variable, the letter. We're trying to get it by itself. So we're trying to move everything away from it. Isolate. You're also going to learn that a term, you're going to hear me say the word term, it's sometimes a number, a variable, or the product of both. And blank is a mathematical statement that two things are equal to each other. So an equation. We talked about expressions a lot. Now we're bringing in equation. What do all these words mean? So let's go ahead and review a little bit expression versus equations. So I'm going to go over some of the vocabulary words that we reviewed, and I need you to understand that when I say term, I could be talking about this here. All of this together is a term. This positive 3 is a term. This 12 over here is a term. So all of these components are terms. Since this here, the first term, has an x attached to it, we refer to it as the x term. This term that doesn't have an x is also known as the constant. So this is the constant term. And as you notice, this 12 doesn't have an x or another letter attached to it, so guess what? That is also a constant. Constant term, x term, because it has an x. You learned expressions. You learned that all of this here was an expression. So I'm going to put all of this was an expression. Now this 12 that's kind of by itself on this side, guess what? That's also an expression. Two expressions that equal each other, that's the key, creates an equation. So all of this put together is what we're going to call an equation. And that's what we're going to be using from now on. Two expressions will equal each other, which is going to give us an equation. So we're going to be doing some solving to make this, to see what value is going to make this equation true. So let's go ahead and start. Solve the indicated variable. Our first problem here, we have x plus 5 is equal to negative 13. What we want is to isolate the variable. That was one of the vocabulary words, isolate. We're trying to get that by itself, isolate it, which means we need to get rid of this here. We don't want it there. So we need to throw it over to the other side of the equal sign. Well, how do you move the 5 over? Easy. Inverse operations. That's another definite vocabulary word we learned. So right now we have a plus 5. To move it over, that means we need the inverse, a minus 5. Since this is a constant term, we're going to subtract it to the other constant term, minus 5. 5 minus 5, this is going to give us a 0. But we don't want to keep writing plus 0 over and over and over. So we cancel it out. We bring down the x. We bring down the equal sign. And then we actually calculate. Negative 13 minus 5 will give us a negative 18. And that right there is our answer. X is negative 18. Some of you might ask, Miss, can you check my work? How do I know I got the right answer? Okay, this is a statement. We're claiming that negative 18 is the answer. So what we're going to do is we're going to substitute. You've been working with that. We're going to replace negative 18 in place of the x. That is called substitute. Plus 5 is equal to negative 13. We're trying to find out, is this really true? Well, negative 18 plus 5, that's negative 13. Guess what? Negative 13 is exactly the same as negative 13. And that's how you check your work. We did it right. Next problem. We have h minus 7 is equal to 20. Isolate the variable was one of the definitions. Here's a variable. Here's what we got to get rid of. So we know we have to move the 7 over. And it's not just any 7, it's a minus 7. So what I'm going to do is draw a line where my equal sign is at, so I know what to move over to the other side. That minus 7, the inverse is to add a 7, so plus 7. Next we're going to combine this. So negative 7 plus 7 is just 0, so that cancels out. Bring down the h. Bring down the equal sign. Here we have that 20 plus 7, do the math, and that gives us a 27. So our answer is h equals 27. But Miss, can you check my work? You can check by substitution. This is a statement that we're claiming. So if h is 27, that means we're going to substitute a 27 where the h is, minus 7, and we're trying to prove, is this really 20? Well, let's see. If we were to subtract those two, does that give you 20? Check with the calculator, and the answer is yes. That does give you 20, so we did this correct. So you understand the idea of substituting your work to verify your answer. So we're going to try another problem. 9 equals 9 over 16. How do you start? Well, look for that variable. There it is. This is in the way, the 16. The 16, you need to pay close attention, is dividing. That means to divide. The inverse of dividing, we said, was to multiply. So we're going to multiply a 16 on this side, because that's where we want to get rid of, in that side. And we're going to move it over to the other side. Okay. In doing that, we get that these two cancel out. So what's free is our n. So n equals 144. And that's our answer. Again, Miss, how do you check this? Substitute. Substitute. Replace the variable with the value. And we're trying to check, is this really going to give us 9? Well, if you type this into your calculator, you'll see that, yeah, 144 over 16 does give you 9. Okay. Next one, 4 over 5 x is equal to 12. This problem can be done in so many different ways. So I'm going to show you 2 different ways. So here it goes. The first one is understanding that this fraction is actually multiplying this variable. Okay, these two are multiplying together. What is the inverse of multiplying? You divide. So we're going to divide by this ugly fraction. And I'm going to put it in parentheses to keep it together. So we know, oh, that whole fraction goes together. Okay. 4 over 5 divided by 4 over 5 is just 1. That we don't need. Bring down the x equals 12 divided by 4 over 5. Now this is going to be tricky if you're using a calculator. You have to be careful how you type it in. When you type it in, you have to type it exactly the way you're seeing it, like this. So it would be 12 divided by parentheses 4 over 5. Okay? Which gives us 15. Now I'm going to rewrite this as x equals 15. You don't have to put the 1 in front of the x. It is understood in math that there is always a 1 in front of the x. We don't necessarily have to write it down. It's there. So it's kind of a waste of time if you keep putting a 1. We don't need it. So x is 15. That's what our answer is. Again, there's different ways of doing it. So this is one way. I'm going to show you a different method. This method is called using the reciprocal. You have to be very careful with this method. Reciprocal means, pretend you have a man or woman doing a jumping jack. What we're going to do is we're going to flip this person so everything is the same, upside down. So that is what we're going to do to the fraction. That is called the reciprocal. You take this and you flip it to this. Okay? So 4 over 5, if I flip it, it becomes 5 over 4. So I'm going to do that on both sides. 5 over 4. I flipped this fraction. Now this fraction with this fraction, they reduce to give us a 1. So from these two we get a 1x. This here gives us 12 times 5, which is 60. 60 divided by 4 gives us 15. So the answer is just 15, just like we got it on the other problem. And guess what? There's still another way to do this. So I guess I'll go ahead and show you the third method. In the third method, I'm going to rewrite this part here, 4 over 5 times x. So that means 4x, over 5 is equal to 12. Okay. So here is our variable. There's two things in the way, 4, 5. What do we get rid of first? Well, let's get rid of fractions. Nobody likes a fraction, so get rid of the fraction first. The fraction means it's dividing. The inverse of dividing means to multiply. So I'm going to multiply by whatever the number down here is going to be. So times 5, what I do to one side, I got to do it to the other. Those two are gone. They reduce. Then we're left with 4 over x. No more fractions. 12 times 5, we said it was 60. Then we have the 4 in front of the x. These are multiplying. To get rid of it, we can divide. So we're going to divide by 4, divide this by 4, that reduces to 1. So then we have that 1x, but remember, we don't have to keep writing that 1. So I'm going to ignore it. X is equal to 15. And that's the third way of doing this problem. Next one, 8 minus y is equal to negative 14. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to put a 1 here so it can help me for the solving part. Always put a 1 where you can put it, where it's allowed to put it. Bring down the equal sign. So here's my variable right there. I need to isolate it, which means we need to move this 8 out of the way. This 8 is a positive 8. We're going to move it over to that constant term, and we're going to do the inverse. We're going to subtract it. Well, this 8 minus 8 is just 0. I'm going to bring this down. Minus 1y is equal to this here. Minus 22. The reason I put a 1 here in the beginning of this problem is so we can see that this negative we need it gone. It cannot be there. So by putting a 1, that means that negative 1 is multiplying y. So how do you get rid of the negative 1? The inverse of multiplying, you divide. So this gives us y. As a result, we get positive 22. And that is our answer. Again, how can you check your work? Substitute the value. This, put it in here, and you'll see that you should get an answer of negative 14. Next one. These problems are starting to get a little tougher, just a little bit. So here we have 5x minus 6 is equal to 24. Here is the variable. Okay. This is attached to the variable. This is just subtracting the variable. So guess what? We want to start with whatever is adding or subtracting the variable, because that's easy. When we move it over, we're going to do the inverse, so we're going to add. That cancels out, it gives us a 0. So we're going to bring this down. (24 plus 6) 30. We want to get rid of the 5. 5, remember, it is multiplying the x. So how do you get rid of the 5 that is multiplying? You do the inverse. You divide by 5. This reduces to a 1, which will look like this, but again, we don't need to put that 1 there. So as a result, we get that x is 30 divided by 5, which reduces to 6. And that's our answer. Let's go ahead and try a couple more examples. X over 2 minus 7 is equal to 45. So we see a fraction, we see this number. Let's start with the easy part first. Nobody likes fractions. So let's start with what's subtracting. This is easy to get rid of because you just move it over, do the inverse. So we do that first. Negative 7 plus 7 gives you a 0. So we have x over 2 plus 0, but again, we don't need to write that. Is the same as 52. We're trying to isolate the variable. Here it is. There's something in the way, a 2 that's dividing. So what is the inverse of dividing? Would be to multiply. So I'm going to multiply a 2. What I do to one side, I got to multiply it on the other side. These cancel. Good riddance. We're done with fractions. Then we're left with this here, 52 times 2. So when we calculate 52 times 2, we get 104. And that is our answer. Okay. Next problem here. They're starting to look a little tougher, but that's fine. We got to take it one step at a time. How do we figure out what to do first in this ugly fraction? Okay, so I'm going to do bubbles. I'm going to do, here's my variable. I want to get that isolated. On top of this fraction, we have a minus 8 in the way. So that's another bubble. What's causing this to be a fraction is a 3. So that's my third bubble. When you pop each bubble, we're going to pop from the largest first. So if I pop the first one, that means we got to get rid of the 3. So the 3 has got to go. How do you get rid of something that is dividing? We multiply. So I'm going to multiply both sides by 3. Gone. No more fractions. So now I have n minus 8. So I'm going to bring it down. N minus 8 is equal to this statement, which says negative 10 times 3. Well, negative 10 times 3 is negative 30. Those give me negative 30. Next thing to do is, here's my variable. I got to move this guy over. How do I move it over? Doing the inverse. Pay attention to the sign. It's subtracting 8. We're going to move 8 over to join this constant buddy over here. So don't get lost with your equal sign. Draw a line. That cancels out, so then we have n is equal to negative 30 plus 8, which gives us negative 22. And I suggest that you really use your calculator on your phone, whatever you have. Check these values. The answer is negative 22. Last problem. Translate the words to an equation and solved. Okay, we've been doing this. Nothing different, except now it's an equation, so there's going to be an equal sign involved. So let's see. The product, remember product means times. So two things are going to get multiplied. 14 times x. Less than means to subtract. 10 is the same as. That means equal to 122. Now be careful. Less than means we gotta turn it around. It's a turnaround word. So I'm gonna rewrite what I have here. 10 goes first, minus 14 times x, so 14x is equal to 122. And we're gonna solve. Again, if you get confused on what to do first, draw balloons. Here's the first thing, that's my variable. Attached to it is a negative 14. And then we have the 10. Okay, pop the largest balloon, and it's 10. So that means we got to get rid of the 10. How do you get rid of a 10? Well, be careful, because some of you might think 10 is subtracting. No, 10 is not subtracting. 10, in front of it, there's nothing, so it's understood to be positive. So we're going to move the 10 over by subtracting 10. We cancel that out. That gives us 0. Then we bring this down. Negative 14x equals 122 minus 10 is 112. Let me check. Then we have this part here with the x. You need to remember that these two are multiplying. So how do you get rid of something that's multiplying? I'm going to put parentheses around it so I know, oh, it's multiplying. The inverse is to divide. Now, don't make the mistake and divide by 14 and completely ignore the negative. So that's a negative 14 divided by negative 14. And we get that our answer is negative 8. Okay. I hope this video helps in solving equations. Bye.